There we go. That's me. Right, we're now going. There's Sam. We thanked him. I don't know where that cartoon comes from. Again, perhaps Angela, you can talk about that. Find out for me. I feel a bit guilty using it without crediting it. It's a lovely picture there. So thanks then, Sam. Let's move on then. Right. So, John Moore. I did a talk with the chairman of the John Moore Museum in 2017, which was the 60th anniversary, I think, of the birth. Is that right? Must be more than that. What's wrong with me? It's but the whole point is, in 2 years' time, it'll be his. I don't know. I'm losing it. It'll be another very significant. How many? Right, it'll be the anniversary of his death in 2 years' time. So, and I'm being told that the John Moore Society is planning on, of course, commemorating that. Now, I hope you've seen what Angela's put out for you tonight. And the John Moore Society is very active, super museum with it. So she will tell you more about it. I was invited by the custodian of the museum to do a talk with him in 2017. Which I did. That's me, you know me now. And got to thank really two people for this. That is a picture there of the author, David Cole, who wrote the book, John Moore, True Country Gentleman. It's a very sad story about David. He's the only speaker I've engaged in 34 years who actually just died before we did the talk, which is a great pity. You'll recognise Lucille there, I hope. We'll talk about her in a minute. But David Cole is very important. He was a policeman, and it was he who tracked down Geoffrey Prime. Do you all know who Geoffrey Prime was? If you don't, if you worked at GCHQ, you will hate the man because the police treated the workers at GCHQ very badly after they discovered him. And of course, because of Geoffrey Prime, who was an imperfect spy with lots of negative points, they had to give up their trade union membership. They were rewarded by £1,000, but Maggie Thatcher, who didn't believe in taxing, taxed their £1,000, and they haven't forgiven them for that. So not only did he arrest Geoffrey Prime, he also wrote this book. It's a heck of a good book. He writes really well. And I am told, and I haven't got any, if anybody can help me there, especially who lives in Twilling, his mother has the diaries written by his father, who was a prisoner of the Japanese in World War II. And bearing in mind what's happening in 2 months' time, I'd like to make contact with David's mother, if you can help me there. So, now, long-term happiness at last. I don't think the John Moore Society approves of me in the history that I write, because I tend to look at it in a very dispassionate way. I look at all the documents as a historian and come to my conclusions. I could actually give you a talk about John Moore's love life before he met the wonderful Lucille. And he was at a real low ebb when he met Lucille. He really was. And something really wonderful happened. You've got to be Lucille. I recognise those gorgeous eyes from the bride's description. I mean, it's wonderful stuff. And there they are getting married in 1944. And I told John he had better get writing. And so he did get writing to make money after they got married. And of course, the success came very soon with Portrait of Elmbury. Put up your hands if you've read it. Oh, thank goodness for that. If anybody haven't got your hands up, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. Go and, especially after tonight, go and get a copy of it and read it. It's wonderful. I might not be a hagiograph about John Moore, but he was a really superman, and he writes beautifully. And it is worth, as I hope I shall prove in this. So that's the book then. There he is. Looks very prosperous there. But he was 18 when he actually started to make money. Sorry, 38 when he started to make money. And so Lucille was happy for a time. Again, I could write about John Moore's relationship with the income tax people, but it's not tonight. Yeah. So, we have to ask this question as historians, don't we? How accurate was the portrait? And this is what John Moore writes. It was built on a framework of truth, but I haven't hesitated to alter names to play tricks with time and geography. Okay? I could also give you a talk about John Moore and the Spanish Civil War. Angela wouldn't like that, because it's slightly different from his story. But never mind, he's a wonderful man. And he then said, where necessary, to import one or two original and purely imaginary wrongdoers. That's the rogues, which we're going to be talking about tonight. And we'll discuss whether we should call them rogues at the end. Libel. His poor mother used to walk down the streets of Tewkesbury after the publication of this book in dread that she would be accused of her son writing libel. And John Moore's mother, again, another story, was a very powerful woman who had a big effect on John's life. So she was not happy with his success because of what he wrote. So, but I don't think anybody did sue him for libel, but she was worried about it, certainly. And I do love the way he writes. And he talks about his family as ivy wraps around a tree. You can see the image there. He's really talking about the poor women who didn't get married in his family. But I could also talk another time about two of his uncles who were middle-class rogues, but we shall wait there. So, as ivy wraps around a tree, read John Moore for his language. It's beautiful. So here we are, Black Sal. And yes, I do love that. I must find out who the drawer is. The mayor has banquets. We ain't got no blanket. Isn't that poetry? That's wonderful. And that's for someone in Double Alley. So it's wonderful stuff, that. And that's why she's right. And this is what John Moore said. Here come the town, she used to say, sorry. Here come the town scoundrels. That, of course, is the councillors, like Councillor Ash, followed by an obscene and libelous running commentary. Okay? And so she was, and what he said was, Double Alley's laughter was one of the ancient sanctions of democracy. Now, John Moore, he might write of these people as rogues or whatever, but he respected them. He saw their role in the history of Tewkesbury. And he also said she died to death. Now that is a good story, which I will tell you about tonight, and which is good. And of course, she was known locally as Old Black Shuck. Why, I don't know. But her actual name was Susanna Evans, which is quite posh, isn't it? As we shall see. So again, we've got problems there. Black Sal, Old Black Shuck, and Susanna Evans. Okay, so what about I'm a social historian, a family historian. Let's look about her. And she was actually born in 1854. She was the daughter of Thomas Evans. I'm surprised he must have been Welsh in some way. He was a labourer from Kemerton, and he lived down Nelson Alley in that area. Now, Nelson Alley is underneath the opticians on Barton Street there. And there you can see Evans, Susanna, Tewkesbury, and she's in the registers on 6A2813. So that's the official birth of her. And that's her registration, so she's official. But usually, if there's a problem, you don't see the father's name in these accounts. Her mother's name was missed off. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. Again, we've got to follow that up. Why was her mother's name not included? And there we are. That's what you find in Find My Past if you want to know more. And there she is, Susanna Evans. Nice posh name. Okay. Now, let's find out about her character from the newspapers. And obviously, newspapers only write about posh people doing good things or bad things. Poor people only get in there when they get into trouble with the law. And 1890, Susan Evans, alias, it tells us Black Sal, of Compton's Alley then, just about down here, she was sentenced to 7 days hard labour for stealing a night dress. Not really a terrible crime, is it? But there you go, that was the Victorian period. And there she is in the register of Gloucestershire Prison. So that proves she was there. And this time, in 1894, she was stealing a piece of pork, I think it says, to the value of a very short amount. So that's what her crimes were. You'll have to judge her crimes, but they were crimes of poverty, weren't they, basically? Again, she was again put in prison in 1904 for hawking clothes without a license. Again, how roguish was that? And interesting, in 1911, she was, I read about it in the newspaper, she was a general servant in Long's Court, but I cannot find her in the census. Now, I have found in doing that work on Stanton, the plaque at Stanton, I couldn't find where Albert Williams was in 1901. His wife said he was living in Double Alley. He doesn't appear on any of the records from Find My Past or Ancestry. So, and often poor people disappeared because they were poor, I would imagine, or they were in boarding houses or moving around to escape the guy coming around doing the census. So I just don't know the answer to that. So she did die in 1927. That was her final death. And there's all the records there. Susanna, last name Evans, okay. She was aged 73, she did very well. And death year was 1927. There's all the details. You can check those up, they are true. Newspaper reports. Just before she died, she was one of the people who were ejected from her house in Double Alley. Now, I hope you all, if you've read John Moore, you know that Double Alley was the most infamous of all the alleys in Tewkesbury. Because John Moore lived opposite it. He saw all that was going on there, drunkenness, fighting, etc., and poverty, of course. And so you didn't let your daughters go down Double Alley. You forbade them for doing that. Yeah. So she was ejected from Double Alley. Oh, sorry, she was then in Glover's Alley that time. I do apologise. That was just underneath the Kremlin now, in a very poor alley. So that's just before she died. And there's her death in the register. Now this is good. Susanna Evans, aged 73, choked by a piece of meat during her supper of cold roast beef. Now think about that. Lodging at 3 Double Alley, she'd moved again for 3 weeks. And she was attended by the wonderful Dr. Devereux of North House. And the post-mortem found a piece of meat 2.5 inches times 1.25 inches, and she died of asphyxia, according to the coroner. So there's a bit of truth there. But, and I do want to make the point that in 1927, when she died, John Moore was still working as an auctioneer. He hadn't left the auction house, so he would know of her, but he wouldn't be selling her house because he hadn't got one. Okay. And John Moore said it was related of her in her later years that she died to death. Now this is, I tell you, John Moore writes well. Look at this. What do you think? The first occurred in her own home when the breath had seized in her. Her husband brought out a bottle of gin and shared it with some of the neighbours, either to celebrate his release from her or to sustain him in his loss. It is recorded that as he poured out the drink, he glanced at the corpse upon the bed and remarked sententiously, "Black Sal, thee served me many a trick in thy time, but never thee served me a trick like this." But Black Sal, halfway to Gehenna, John Moore he knew his Bible, especially the Old Testament. He smelled the gin, hastened back and finished the bottle. I hope that is true. And then it goes, and after the first death, she survived for many years, until at last becoming destitute, she was taken to the workhouse, where amongst other indignities, she suffered that of being forcibly washed. This killed her, and the chilly, hard-hearted institution provided no bottle of gin to lure her back to life. I think, a bit of history there, the workhouse actually didn't exist after 1911. It changed into Homewood House, which was an old people's home, a poor old people's home, which is now Weber House, and it's now a retirement complex there. So he's not quite right there. Homewood House was better than the workhouse, but only marginally so. So lovely. Thank you, John Moore, for that. And I did check to see she was buried, and there is her burial there. She's burial 773 in the town's cemetery. Now, I didn't go to find it because I knew I would not find it. Why? Because you had to have money to have a headstone. And the vast majority of people who died in Tewkesbury who were poor didn't have a headstone, as some of you know because you've been to check on your ancestors. So, and I had the same problem finding where Albert Edwards was buried as well. Even though he had the people the contractors of the railway when he died, they provided him with a superb coffin, but no headstone, the wretched people. So you cannot find him. And I've been to look, I've been out with a wonderful Phil, and we couldn't find where we thought the grave was. And that's where Albert Edwards is buried there, not with a headstone. If you see grass at the cemetery, it's not just pretty, it's where there were burials. There were burials of poor people, which are now grass. Well, that's life, isn't it? So, that's one rogue, if you like to think of a rogue. These are the other rogue, the famous ones here. And of course, this is Pistol, Bardolph, and Nym, who were called by John Moore the town scoundrels. Maybe I should have talked about scoundrels rather than rogues. We'll come on to that later. And again, John Moore has a great sympathy with these people. He called the odd job man the last free men of Elmbury, he called them. And he talked about a Jim Fletcher who earned £3 for 4 days a week, whereas in those days a labourer working for 52 hours a week only earned 30 shillings. And he said he lived like a lord, and he chose to work when it rewarded him. If it didn't reward him, he didn't work. And John Moore respected that. And he then wrote, they were in fact a sort of privileged class, a level on the whole community. All the rest of us, he would look down on us because we only work because we're obliged to work to keep up appearances, etc. But a lot of the people in Tewkesbury only work when they need to, and they enjoy freedom. And if they had no money, they accepted it. That's what John Moore said. Now, Lucille, bless her, she also remembers these men, and she discussed one of them wearing an Australian hat with flowers, directing traffic around the cross. That would get in the newspapers. And his assegai wound, he claimed, was actually a poaching wound. Okay, so, and that's the roguery, if you like, poaching in those days. And so, right, so the town scoundrel. Now, I'm putting the Anchor up there because they used to inhabit the Anchor Inn. I'm very fond of the Anchor Inn. I'm fond of the landlady there, but it did have a dodgy history at times. That's in 1958. Now, we think that Pistol was actually Drinkwater. You had to have that nickname, didn't you, with Drinkwater? And he earned his living by doing odd jobs when he was able to, but he had been a skilled bricklayer when younger. Okay? Now, he had, somebody knew him, and that's a councillor there, and they lived in Gloucester Road. They weren't well off, but they were Methodists, and they lived as Methodists do, and they didn't approve, of course, of Drinkwater. And there, Anita Edmund is down there at the bottom there. She said, if Drinkwater looked in the mirror, he would see his worst enemy. Well, you know what that means, don't you? So they would not approve of the Drinkwaters because of the way of life. Bethany, of course, sorry about these bottles tonight. You're not allowed to open them here, of course. That we don't approve of alcoholic liquor. Excess of it. Bardolph, we think, was Fred Underwood. I taught some Underwoods in Tewkesbury School. And now Dr. David Evans used to present the Woodard Award before Stephen very kindly took over. And sadly he's died now, and he was a professor writing about World War II and other things. And his grandma lived where today is Melanie's in the High Street. Okay, and he remembers He had the most wonderful stories told in the Anchor again about their adventures in the First World War. Fred's house in Praise Court, which is still there, was close to being a museum of war-time memorabilia. Okay? And there is a picture from the First War, and that we think is, well, we know is Fred Underwood, who served in the First World War with the Gloucesters. He was related to, but he wasn't the son of the guy who died at Malvern, was the first loss in the First World War. And that's his dates there. And he won the military medal. He was the first man from Tewkesbury to win the military medal, yet he's called a rogue. What happened to him after the war? Now that is a good question. We don't learn enough of what happened to men after they got back from the war, if they survived. What was their life like? And a lot of them, of course, they had a very difficult life, finding work, and they turned to drink. We all know the problem of PTSD now, don't we? So we've got to be a bit sympathetic there. We know about him because he got into court, as you see there, same year that Black Sal died. And he was bound over for his good behaviour, charged with stealing a little bit of money there from the Nottingham Arms Inn, just across the road. He'd be drinking there. So that shows you he's a rogue, or does it? And again, I remind you, the military medal, the first one in Tewkesbury from a rogue. And when he did die, at least they gave him that headline, which is quite significant, really. So, military medal's death. That's his dates again. So he had a good life. He lived to 63 in those days. Now, Anita Redmond, she was aged 81 in 2007. I'm a bit afraid I haven't heard from Anita for a long time. But he lived with his family in Chan Street, which you know where it is. A tall, dark-haired, rather lanky character called Underwood also lived there. He hung around with Harry and his cronies. He was the character Bardolph in the books, I believe, and always wore an old greasy cap. My mother gave our pram away when my brother and I no longer needed it to a church charity. That'll be Trinity. And I remember her pointing it out one day, being pushed by Mrs. Underwood, who loaded it with firewood. Well, that's a roguish, well, is it? Or is it poverty, you see? Yeah. Actually, she got it wrong, because it was a different Underwood, and that was actually Charles Underwood, his brother. There we go. It was a big family. And John Moore, of course, he did well. He wrote Portrait of Ellen, but he started to make money after that. And he kept this story going on into his later books. The Blue Field was his third book. And he saw them as Poforth Spids, the petty lords of Ali Underwood. You know, is it Private Walker in Dad's Army? They were there all the time. I love the Blue Field because it's a battle with bureaucrats, with civil servants, who were trying to force farmers locally to grow linseed. They didn't want to. And he ends up barricading himself in the house, the farmhouse, and shooting at people coming there. And that is very roguish, isn't it? But so John Moore, you can read about there. John Moore was also interested that we had a William Hart, who was descendant of William Shakespeare. And he's right, he's in the Baptist cemetery there. Okay. Now, I don't know if you know Mike Walsh. He was actually born in Prize Park. He's a bit older than me. And he writes quite a lot on Facebook. And he sent me some very interesting, this account of the characters. John Moore in his book talks of Pistol, Barlet and Limb. 3 of the roguish characters whom Shakespeare wrote, for whom he thought were reflected in 3 of the people he'd met in the town. They were identifiable, of course, and were known locally because of their drinking habits. They were quietly visible and in and around the town, but they were always polite, saying yes, or yes sir, or your worship, whenever they spoke. They were obviously thinking about the magistrates, weren't they? So, my first encounter with them was on a quiet Sunday afternoon while listening to the radio, when there was a knock on the door, and Mr. Underwood and Mr. Drinkwater Water politely asked if we would be interested in buying a quantity of mushroom, okay, or a rabbit. And uncertain as the origin, we declined the offer, after which they thanked us and went to the next house. Okay. Mr. Drinkwater could have made a good living in the building trade, as he was an excellent bricklayer. According to one local builder, it is stated that in order to keep him out of trouble, he was commissioned to build the curved wall that went around the front of the Trinity Church. Sam, is this it? I don't. The one on the right there. You must look that up, Sam. What? It's not a round wall now, but you could find that up, Sam. Anyway, so he's now my walls. I've been trying to get hold of on the internet. I've tried to get him on Facebook. He had a stroke when I had mine 3 years ago, and as he's older than me, I'm worried that he's no longer with us. I would like to meet him because he's written this wonderful book on PDF, Saints and Sinners in Tewkesbury. So not rogues, but sinners. And he was related to a lot of the people in the book. And I want to put it, with his permission, to put it on the website because it's all he wrote was there what they know of the family history of all these rogues and when they went to court, when they got in the newspapers. And it needs a bit of sorting out, but it's very, very good. So hopefully we'll get it on the website before too long. And that's Mike Walsh. Perpetual success. Well, this is his subsequent career. He left the Ardently a committed socialist. Now in those days, committed socialist meant you were in favour of the welfare state. It's not quite the same as it is today. He then produced French and Village, which I'm not so keen on. It's more about country life. And then this Blue Field, which I think is worth reading. And eventually he got the country column in the Birmingham Evening Mail for 10 years a week, and the job loss returned. At last he had money. The poor chap, when he turned into journalism, he didn't make money until Lucille made him, basically. Now, talking about Lucille, I was lucky enough to meet Lucille when we started in 1991. She was very much alive and very influential. She used to call me Dawn. Oh, hello, Dawn, how are you? Which is interesting because she's Australian, and I don't think she actually spoke like that, except in later life. So she's a wonderful lady, and we were given some money in 1991 for the society. Bill Camp, the treasurer, wouldn't tell me who gave it. I think it was her. But I've got no, again, perhaps Angela, you could prove that or not. But I always think it's her because she was so lovely. And yeah, so they got married, he made money, but their life was not easy. But again, that's another story, not for tonight. And yeah, and they did have a bookshop. I'll explain in a minute where it was, and it didn't work, didn't make money, so they had to sell it. That was the story of John Moore's life, often. And that's where it is today. So when you go to the Abbey Tea Rooms for your tea and cakes, think that the lovely Lucille Moore sold books in there. Sadly, no more. So there he is. He died in that date, 1967. Which I think, oh gosh, is that 60 years ago next year? Have I got that right? Oh, God, I got it right, 60 years. And of course, he didn't like his school in Malvern, but he did imbibe the Latin, and you'll see lots of bits of Latin in this book. And this is his last words, Fumes Troyes fuit illum. I'm supposed to be good at Latin, I was in those days, but to translate it, there's Trojans fumed and fled Troy. So that's a good way to lead your life, isn't it? And so there we go. And there, just to say goodbye to lovely Lucille. And she did marry a second time to Dr. Bell, who was the headmaster of H. Grammar School in Charlton. And I used to visit her when she was making jewellery, living in the mine. So yeah, she was lovely. On a long time now. So. Significance of John Moore. Okay. That, you've got to tell me straight away, is out of date. It is, because it should be Badlands now. I should have got into the Cheese Cafe, taking another photograph. I apologise for that, but it is bad stuff. And that's what he could see out of his nursery windows, and that's what inspired him to write A Portrait of Melbury. And that is why it's such a wonderful book. So, and I love this phrase, I belong to the place as a limb belongs to the body. What a wonderful way of expressing himself. He does write so well. He really does. So, John Moore's Rose, that's my, should I not have called them scoundrels? I looked up on Thesaurus, and it could be knave. There's lots of different definitions of rogues and scoundrels. Perhaps rogue is too strong, I don't know. You'll have to think about that. A lot of people helped me, the late David Cole with his book, the late Mrs. Lucille Moore. I fear it might be the late Denise Rose, and I fear it might be the late Mike Walsh, who actually lives in Vancouver now, or did. Yeah, so they helped me very much, as you can see. And I could go on and talk about middle class rogues, just to keep the social balance. But you've had enough tonight, so you'll have to invite me back if you want. There were two relations of his who disappeared, and John Moore couldn't explain it. I can, as a historian. But that's another story.